Have you ever wondered why one steak can cost $20, while another from the very same cow sells for over $200? The answer isn't the chef or the seasoning. It's hidden inside the animal itself. Every steak comes from a different muscle, and every muscle had a different job throughout the cow's life. The harder a muscle worked, the tougher it became. The less it worked, the more tender it stayed. That one simple rule explains almost every cut of beef you'll ever eat. So, let's take a journey across the cow and discover why every steak tastes completely different. Our journey begins at the shoulder, the hardest working part of the entire cow. Every time the animal walks, lowers its head to graze, or simply shifts its weight. These muscles are constantly at work. Because they're used so often, they develop thick muscle fibers, strong connective tissue, and large amounts of collagen. That makes the meat naturally firm and tough. One of the best examples is the chuck roast. For years it was considered a cheap cut because grilling it quickly usually produced a dry, chewy steak. But scientists and pitmasters discovered something fascinating. Collagen doesn't stay tough forever. When the meat is cooked slowly for several hours, that collagen begins to break down into gelatin. Instead of making the meat tough, it makes it incredibly juicy and tender. That's why a chuck roast can become one of the most flavorful cuts on the entire animal, as long as you're willing to be patient. The shoulder teaches us one important lesson. A tougher cut doesn't mean a worse cut. It simply means it was built for a different style of cooking. But as we move away from the shoulder, the muscles begin working less, and something extraordinary starts to appear inside the meat. Marbling. Welcome to the ribs. As we move away from the hard-working shoulder, the anatomy of the cow begins to change. The muscles along the ribs have a much easier job. Instead of constantly supporting movement, their main role is simply to help stabilize the body. Because they work far less, they remain naturally softer. But something even more important begins to appear. Tiny white streaks of fat spread throughout the muscle. This is known as marbling, and it's one of the biggest reasons why some steaks taste so incredible. Unlike the thick layer of fat around the outside of a steak, marbling is found inside the muscle itself. When the steak hits a hot grill, those tiny pockets of fat slowly melt, basting the meat from the inside. The result is an incredibly juicy steak, rich and packed with flavor. This is the ribeye. For many chefs and steak lovers, it's considered the perfect balance between tenderness and taste. Not because it's the most tender steak, but because every bite is filled with melted marbling that makes the flavor unforgettable. And from this very same section of the cow comes one of the most famous steaks in the world, the tomahawk. At first glance, the tomahawk looks like a completely different steak. Its long rib bone, its impressive size, and its dramatic presentation have made it one of the most recognizable cuts in the world. But here's the surprise. The tomahawk isn't actually a different cut of beef. It's the very same ribeye, with one important difference. The rib bone is left long and untrimmed. That single detail transforms an ordinary-looking steak into something that resembles an ancient tomahawk axe, which is exactly how it got its name. Many people believe the long bone adds extra flavor to the meat, but that's mostly a myth. During a normal grilling session, very little flavor actually travels from the bone into the steak. What really makes a tomahawk taste incredible is exactly what made the ribeye so famous. It's beautiful marbling. The bone isn't there to change the flavor. It's there to create an unforgettable presentation. It's a steak designed to impress long before you take your first bite. But just a little farther down the cow, we're about to discover a steak that's famous for the exact opposite reason. Not because of its appearance, but because it's the most tender muscle on the entire animal. As we continue moving toward the back of the cow, we arrive at a muscle unlike any we've seen so far. Hidden along the spine, protected deep inside the animal, lies the tenderloin. This muscle has one of the easiest jobs in the entire body. It doesn't help the cow walk, it doesn't support much weight, and it performs very little physical work throughout the animal's life. Because of that, its muscle fibers remain extremely fine and delicate. The result is the most tender steak you can buy. When cut into thick medallions, it's known as filet mignon. It almost melts in your mouth. But here's something that surprises many people. Although it's the most tender cut, it isn't always considered the most flavorful. Why? Because the tenderloin contains much less marbling than a ribeye. Less intramuscular fat means a milder beef flavor. That's why many chefs wrap filet mignon in bacon, or serve it with rich butter or sauces, to add extra flavor without losing its incredible tenderness. As we continue our journey, we're about to discover a steak that perfectly balances tenderness and bold beef flavor, the New York strip. Right next to the tenderloin lies another legendary steak, the New York strip. These two muscles sit side by side, but they couldn't be more different. Unlike the tenderloin, the New York strip does a little more work during the animal's life. Not enough to become tough, but enough to develop a firmer texture. That's why it has a satisfying bite while remaining tender. It also contains more marbling than the tenderloin, and that extra fat gives it a richer, beefier flavor. For many steak lovers, the New York strip offers the best of both worlds. It's tender enough to cut easily with a knife, yet bold enough to deliver the deep, classic taste people expect from a great steak. That's why it's been one of the signature steaks in American steakhouses for generations. But nature has one more surprise waiting just a few inches away. What if you didn't have to choose between a tenderloin and a New York strip? What if one steak gave you both? Meet the T-bone. As we continue through the short loin, nature gives us something truly unique. Instead of one steak, it combines two of the most famous cuts into a single piece of meat. This is the T-bone. Its name comes from the T-shaped bone that separates two completely different muscles. You have the New York strip firm, rich, and packed with bold beef flavor. On the other side, you'll find the tenderloin, the most tender muscle in the entire cow. That means every T-bone offers two completely different eating experiences in a single steak. One side is juicy and intensely flavorful. The other is incredibly soft and buttery. It's one of the few cuts that lets you compare two muscles from the same animal at the same meal. But here's something many people don't know. Not every T-bone is the same. If the tenderloin portion becomes significantly larger, the steak receives a completely different name, the Porterhouse. At first glance, a Porterhouse looks almost identical to a T-bone. Both have the famous T-shaped bone. Both combine two premium steaks in a single cut, and both come from the same area of the cow. So what's the difference? It all comes down to one muscle, the tenderloin. A Porterhouse is cut slightly farther back on the short loin, where the tenderloin is much larger. That means you get a bigger portion of the most tender steak on the animal, without losing the rich, beefy flavor of the New York strip on the other side. Because it offers generous portions of both muscles, many people consider the Porterhouse the king of steaks. It's large, impressive, and often big enough to feed two people. But as we leave the short loin behind, the muscles begin working a little harder again. And that brings us to another American classic, the sirloin. As we leave the short loin behind, the muscles begin working a little harder again. This brings us to the sirloin. Located just behind the New York strip and tenderloin, the sirloin comes from a larger, more active section of the cow, because this area helps with movement and balance. The meat is not as soft as filet mignon, and it doesn't have as much marbling as a ribeye, but that's exactly what makes it interesting. Sirloin gives you a strong beef flavor, a firmer bite, and a much better price. It's one of the most practical steaks in America, because it can be grilled, sliced, marinated, or used in everyday meals without feeling too expensive. It may not be the most luxurious cut, but it gives you something many people actually want: good flavor, decent tenderness, and great value. But now, we're leaving the back of the cow and moving down to one of the toughest muscles on the entire animal, the brisket. Unlike the steaks we've explored so far, this muscle supports much of the cow's body weight every single day. Since cows don't have collarbones, their chest muscles help suspend the entire front half of the body. That constant workload builds thick muscle fibers and an enormous amount of connective tissue. At first, that makes the meat incredibly tough, but the brisket hides an incredible secret. Given enough time, it completely transforms. After hours of slow cooking, the collagen slowly melts into rich gelatin, turning what was once one of the toughest cuts into one of the juiciest and most flavorful. That's why authentic Texas barbecue isn't cooked in minutes. It's cooked for 10, 12, or even 16 hours. The brisket proves that sometimes the best flavor simply can't be rushed. But there's one final stop on our journey, a thin, flavorful muscle that's become a favorite for grilling all around the world, the skirt steak. Unlike the premium steaks we've explored so far, this muscle works constantly. It helps stabilize the cow's body and assists with every movement the animal makes. Because of that, it develops long, coarse muscle fibers, giving it a firmer texture than many other cuts. But what it lacks in tenderness, it more than makes up for in flavor. Skirt steak has one of the richest, beefiest flavors on the entire animal. That's why it's a favorite for fajitas, tacos, and hot grills around the world. There's just one important secret. After cooking, it must always be sliced against the grain. Cutting across the long muscle fibers shortens them, making every bite far more tender. Cut it the wrong way, and even a perfectly cooked skirt steak can feel surprisingly chewy. Sometimes, the difference between a great steak and a disappointing one isn't the cut itself. It's simply knowing how to slice it. So the next time you order a steak, you'll know you're not just choosing a piece of meat, you're choosing a muscle, a lifetime of movement, and a completely different eating experience. If you enjoyed discovering the science behind everyday things, don't forget to subscribe to Discovery Why, because every day and there's always something new to discover. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.